All right, well, thank you for joining me today on the Teaching That Counts podcast. Once again, I am your host, Abel Maesis. I am an instructional coach here in Series Unified. Today, I get the lovely privilege of speaking to two coaches that I work with here at the office. I say at the office, but really we're only at the office every once in a while. We're out working with teachers. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Kelly Linhares. I'm an instructional coach in the district.
I'm Melanie Roche. I am math coach for the district with a focus on K-6 and intervention. We should have gone with Kel and Mel. That would have been more fun.
Oh, yes. It's Kel and Mel show.
The Kel and Mel show, yeah. So over the course of this year, I've been doing a book study, and the listeners have been listening on the book study that I've been working with some high school teachers. And both of you have been working with the elementary school on what this looks like, building thinking classrooms in the elementary school. So today we're going to talk about building thinking classrooms, and really I want you to pick your brain on what's been happening in our elementary schools and how are the littles doing with it, and what are you seeing there? So I guess just give our listeners a little bit of background on what you've been doing this year with building thinking classrooms.
So I decided to pilot this with a fourth grade group. If for those of you in elementary education know that fourth grade can be a struggle as far as going from a classroom in third grade from 24 students to a classroom of 32 students. That being said, there's a lot of kids in the room that are used to one-on-one teacher time, and now they don't have that. So we tried it with a group where we strictly took the IM curriculum that they're using and use those for their problems of the day. We randomly passed out cards to everybody for their groups, and they started standing and talking. And what we saw was amazing compared to when they were at their desks, heads down, slouched, not really engaged, but as when they were in their group standing and talking, they were engaged. All three students were part of the work. And then we would walk around to other groups to see their work. The students demonstrated confidence when presenting with the work they had done. Other students in the room were asking questions or also willing to share how they did it differently.
Can I just say ditto? I'm just kidding. So told you, comedy career.
Yeah.
So I was fortunate enough to be invited in to one of the classrooms that Kelly was working in and able to experience this firsthand. We have been talking with certain teams of teachers or individual teachers throughout the year of how this could be the oomph that they add to their classroom, the one extra thing that's going to get their kids kind of to that next level of conversation. And it was awesome to be invited into a classroom starting from, I think, the planning phase. We planned together. We did have to make an adjustment to the IM activity just to make it a little bit more open-ended to allow for some more answers. But what we saw in the classroom once the students were standing and in the random groups was absolutely amazing. And with practices 1, 2, and 3, you kind of go naturally into some of the other practices with questioning without even really kind of implementing it. And just how we questioned and talked to the students, there wasn't a lot of telling, but there was a lot of them telling. Even with looking at the groupings, the teacher had some stuff and reflections to say about how certain students, when grouped together, still actually worked really well together and kind of played off each other. So yeah, it definitely had the momentum in there, and I think it passed on to another team. Or another teacher at that time that also wanted to start implementing. So we've gone and had discussions about room arrangement and things.
It also passed on, this particular teacher has 5 students that leave for special education, and their teacher approached me and was like, I heard about this, and they are loving math. Like, what are you doing? So I shared with the resource teacher at their site, like, this is it. And she, I believe, has done a little portion of it. I'm not sure. I haven't been in that room, but she was amazed how engaged they were, how they came into her room right after talking about math. So I'm hoping that other teachers will take this on next year.
I love hearing that. In the previous episode, I talked to Sydney Merchant. She's doing this with her resource kids, 7th and 8th graders, and she's seen such a growth in their math identity. And we've talked about this, I think, for years, right? Mm-hmm. How math identity is kind of the number one thing. We get kids feeling like they belong in math, then it all comes from there. And so what you're saying is that the kids, even kids that don't feel like they've been successful in mathematics in the past are starting to see that in themselves just by changing some of the things that they're doing in class. And I'm really excited to hear how that goes for the littles I call them the littles, but for elementary kids especially in the special ed realm. I have this feeling so often. I think I spoke to Sydney about this. Some teachers, not every teacher, some teachers, when we are brought upon with change, we often think, well, what about these kids? Well, what about these kids? Well, what about these kids? And really, we're talking about all kids. And that really all kids can succeed at high levels. We just got to give them the opportunities to do that. And I think the practices really do it. I really feel like they do, from what we've seen at the high school level and the junior high level, and now from what we're hearing at the elementary. You mentioned the random groupings. Mm-hmm. How did how are kids doing with the random groupings? I know that we've had some issues with students passing cards around at the high school level and really getting them to be okay with being in random groups, especially at the 9th grade. How do you feel that's working with the elementary kids?
The day I'm laughing because as an adult, I've seen adults do this at a conference too, where you get a card and you're like, oh, switch me cards so I can be with my friends. And, that's not just
we all sit at the same table, right?
I think we all have that level of discomfort when we are going to be randomized. I think the class where we were in, I was in there, I think the 3rd or 4th or 5th or 6th time that it had been done. And I think it just happened. It wasn't something to where it seemed like I saw any kids passing their cards around. They just kind of knew that was the expectation. They all got their card passed out to them, and then they kind of just went to their groups.
They did go to their groups. The teacher had the specific roles for each of the symbols that matched their card. So each day they basically were in a new group with most likely a new role. If we did 2 activities, we would have them switch roles just so they got a chance. Another student got a chance to write, or another person got a chance to speak. So that helps too. But in 4th grade, they're not there yet as far as switching groups. Her classroom culture also, we started this in February, so she had already built the classroom culture of trust and comfort, so they know like it's okay to make mistakes even if they are in a group without their friends. It's just 2 other kids, so it wasn't a huge change for them, or discomfort, I should say.
Yeah, one thing he talks about in the book is when you start this, I think this is in chapter 15, late in the book, he talks about when you start doing these practices, and that you really need to start with 1, 2, and 3. Like those are the ones you got to start with right away, all together. But when you start with any change in the middle of the year, then it becomes a change, and kids struggle with change in the middle of the year. But when you start with these things at the beginning of the year, they become a norm, and norms kids are fine with.
Right.
So I hear what you're saying, in that it takes a little bit to get the kids going, especially in a change in the middle of the year. Speak to like the engagement piece, because I know that I feel like we've talked about this before, in that there's just a switch in the engagement.
Are we referring to that lesson where Melanie shut the children down? Kelly was there for that.
Talk to us, Melanie, about the lesson where you shut the kids down.
You know what? It was definitely a learning experience to see how the stuff in the book is actually kind of correct. So we were in the lesson, and we had to stand and do most of the lesson, didn't we, Kelly?
The whole lesson until the cool down, or till the air now.
Or lesson synthesis or something like that.
It was the lesson synthesis.
And so, having not had super amount of time of experience of this in practice, we're like, okay, let's go back to our seats and synthesize together. Synthesization, or whatever it's called, was silent. You could just completely see the level of engagement or disengagement. So engagement definitely decreased, and we got back to the slouching. It was
a kid asked to go to the bathroom.
So
like, I don't want to get called on. I need to go get a new pencil. Just all of the normal norms of kids not wanting to do math all of a sudden was clearly evident.
And for me, it was like, wow. Like, I stopped, and like Kelly and the teacher and I were talking. It's like, wow. Like, you don't think about it when you're in the moment, because you're so excited about them being engaged and standing and doing the math, to see what an effect of having them go back to their seat had on their engagement, and their participation was just, wow, was all I had to say.
Wow.
So I did that. I did that.
So then
Will I do it again?
No. Then
No.
we continue to have them stand for that part of the lesson and then return to their desks when they actually get to the independent work. Speaking of that, the teacher has commented on how much the scores have increased in the independent work on the daily cool downs compared to when she started this before. She said their scores have gone up, consistent proficiency levels just from doing this.
Yeah.
So nothing besides vertical articulation happening. Their scores have gone up, she thinks, because they're doing the work with their groups.
So there's 14 practices, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm getting from you is that really you're focusing on the first 3. The task, the task is written with our curriculum. We're using illustrative mathematics in the elementary grades and at the junior highs. And that is a problem-based curriculum, so the tasks are already embedded in that. So that takes care of one for the teachers.
That's not to say that you might want to look at making an edit just to make it a little bit more open-ended or have more choice and response, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I saw some really cool things online on open middle, using some open middle tasks for using the practices, and they're really working really great using open middle. So there might be some ways of changing that. But in terms of teacher preparation, like that's done for them, right? That's gives them a head start in one of the practices. And then the second practice is random assignment. Well, we're working on that, and then the grouping on the vertical non-permanent surfaces. So right now you've been focusing on those 3 things. Right? There's a lot of other stuff that kind of goes with it when he talks about flow and grading and all of the other pieces behind it. But those 3 things have made such an impact right now. And not only in the way the kids are feeling, but how well they're doing in using hard data. Right, with quizzes. Right. And we're seeing the same thing in the high school. One of the teachers that's been doing this has been charting exit ticket proficiency levels, and she's consistently getting 60 to 80 to 95% of kids doing well on her exit tickets. So I think it's a good thing if we can get more people charting some of this data. I think a lot of people just want to see data like. We know it's going to work. We see it. But I think, the big wigs want to see some other things like numbers.
Right. Yep. And I'm assuming that we can go back and look at her grade book or her however she collects it to show here it is till February. Here's when we started IM math.
Yeah. What are you guys looking towards the future? Like as we move forward with elementary and using these practices, what are you looking forward to maybe even next year? I know we're here in May, but starting next year.
I'm looking forward to more teachers doing it because it is spreading at this site. It is starting to spread a little bit. These kids that are in the 4th grade now, if 5th grade, they'll have the expectation, I'm get to move and stand during math. And hopefully 5th grade teachers will see, this helps the, classroom collaboration piece, helps with management. So I'm hoping it'll start to spread a little bit more just because of the engagement and the kids doing the heavy lifting and the work.
I think another thing too is it is complementing / refining / consolidating the learning that we've been doing over the past 6 or 7 years on these areas of collaboration, of the area of math identity. And it's bringing in the practices that really that work. They work in practice. It's not just the theory of students needing to work in collaborative groups and how they do that. It's refining it. So going from they need to collaborate together. And we had the flat collaborative whiteboards. They worked in groups. And we always called it, butts out of seats, doing math and leaning into the math and things like that. But I think it's taking it to the next level and maybe to a better level where it's like, okay, what are they called? I always say it wrong. Non-permanent, vertical.
Vertical non-permanent surfaces.
What he just said. And taking that. And that's that next level. It's like now I'm up completely out of my seat and I'm engaged and I'm talking. So for teachers that are looking into doing this, it's not completely new, but it's the practice that's going to make it better.
Yeah.
And realizing it's not one more thing to do. The questions are mostly there. Yes, you have to look. Maybe I'm going to combine 2 questions. Maybe I want to provide some graph paper next to their vertical boards just so they can line up numbers or whatever, a little scaffold, which you would do anyway in your class. You'd print that anyway for your students. So now instead of 32, you're only printing, 10. But other than that, it's not one more thing to prep. It's one more, it's already done. Most of it's done for you. It's just literally finding the space in the room to set up the vertical whiteboards.
Yeah. How do they deal with space in the rooms for element? I mean, when you get 30, 32, is that what it gets started in
32.
fourth grade? When you get 32 kids in a room, and now I'm not saying, that high school teachers don't tend to put up a lot of stuff on their walls. But if you, right, if you generally go to a high school class, you're going to see more posters than you're going to see like student work all over the place, right? And we're really talking about high school and junior high, you're only teaching one course or a couple of topics, but you're not teaching, ELA and math and science and social studies all day. So, I walk into my kids' class and there's a lot of stuff all over the room. How do they use their space wisely with whiteboards?
We got creative.
They use it wisely.
Oh, that's what we don't know how, though.
There may have been some writing on windows that comes off.
Writing on windows,
writing
yeah.
on windows.
I bet the kids love. I bet little kids love to do that, right?
The kids that got those two groups were excited. We, laminated posters. We just might have turned over a poster and put it on the side of a bookshelf and use the magnets, and there's another. We tried right on the bookshelf. The marker didn't come off very well. So instead, a laminated poster on the side of the bookshelf. So that's a space. Thankfully, the elementary classrooms here do have 2 walls of whiteboards, so that freed up quite a bit of room. An easel, the back of a easel with chart, like a lamp piece. Another laminated poster to use as a whiteboard. So we're looking into getting some vertical whiteboards to place around the rooms instead of laminated posters or windows. But, there's enough room. It's just moving things around.
And being creative.
They're not letting the lack of the thing stop them from doing the thing and
That's
having
awesome.
students standing up. So they're definitely looking at ways that can happen.
Yeah, I feel sometimes we use that as, I don't have it. But that's pretty cool. I know, I just, hopefully the second or first graders aren't going home and writing on their family's windows at the house.
I think it happens regardless if they're
Right.
in the classroom or not.
They're going to be writing on the walls anyway. But my teacher said I could do that. How does the fourth grade teacher deal with the 32? Like, that's a lot of students to be in the classroom. So have you been doing 3 people in each group? And how has that been going with terms of space? And
Like I said, I think every 3 feet of wall space is pretty much used around the perimeter of the room. And the teacher literally just stands in the middle and walks group to group to group. Just because once you're in the middle, you can see what groups are working. She can easily identify the groups that are kind of struggling. Maybe there's a group that finishes early. She gives them a continuation or another question to consider for the problem. It's not terrible because she's in the middle and just looking around the perimeter.
Yeah.
I agree. In the presentation in that classroom, being able to be in the middle and just kind of do a circle and see, you can definitely pick out, because of how they're working and how their work is presented, of who needs the support or who we might have to check in and ask a couple of follow-up questions to assess where they are and to help advance those that also need, like I said, they need a little bit more to move on. And they do a pretty good job, because they one thing I like is that they do look at what other people are doing. It's like they're self-correcting themselves, because other people's work's actually visible for me. And it's not that whole idea of like I'm copying them, but sometimes that does help us build our confidence. If I'm doing something and I kind of look over at my neighbor doing, like, oh, we're kind of on the same page, so I don't feel as intimidated. Or if we have something different, it's like, oh, are talking to our group, are we approaching this correctly? Or maybe even having a little chat with the group next to us once in a while to just see if we're on the same page. And as a teacher, I only have 10 or 11 groups to check into rather than all 32 students to check into. So it's much more efficient, I think.
And it was easy for the kids to present as everyone just kind of gathered to the middle of the room and looked at one, like stood back enough so that the group could present on their whiteboard what they had done, and then quickly go back, send the rest of the kids back to their whiteboards after hearing, oh, here's an example, or here's how they approached it. I have an idea, and go back that way too.
Yeah, that knowledge mobility is a real thing when you get to see it. I think that's one thing that we talked about in a previous podcast is, he talks about knowledge mobility and that students, you want the whole class to be able to share their knowledge. And while they're doing the task, they look over, they get an idea from that. He talked about that happens a lot more with the little kid. Like the little kids are really easier at like looking at and seeing and getting new ideas. I know that I've struggled with with ninth graders doing that. It's almost like they don't want to look everywhere else. And I don't know if that's because they've learned through years and years that looking at somebody else's work is copying. But I like the idea that we're starting young and changing that idea that we're in this together to come up with ideas to solve problems.
I think that's a progression. I think that as they do go through grades K through 6, they start to it's a kindergarten, everything's great and wonderful, and we all learn from each other and no one really knows. There's a process, but it's not because there's other factors aren't involved yet, like grades. I'm truly learning to learn, and I'm learning from someone else, and I'm looking at what they're doing and I'm connecting it to what I'm doing. But I think as they progress through, it's that whole don't cheat off me, or we have those divider things we put between kids when they're doing assessments and things like that, start to put in their mind that looking at other people's stuff is bad. So by the time they get to high school, it's I'm not going to look at anybody's because someone's going to call me out on it and something bad's going to happen to me.
Right.
So I think it's just changing the mindset of when it's okay to.
Well,
share.
I mean, they're going to grow up with ChatGPT that pretty much can answer a lot of things, but how do we use it for inspiration, not for just...
Well, you have to remember, too, that junior high and high school kids, they refer to YouTube or Khan Academy.
Oh, yeah.
They learn things by watching all the time, whether it's anything to do with sports or cooking or how to do makeup. So I think if we get them into the mindset, you're already on your phone looking at whatever you want to figure out how to do something. This is the culture of our classroom. We don't get to YouTube it. We're going to YouTube our friends and
YouTube our friends, yeah.
What connection do you see between your work, your work and your neighbor's work?
Right?
Look over there. What do you see? And ask them those questions.
Yeah.
Getting them, because they're not afraid to go on their phone and look something up. So we need to get them into, let's use our peers. It's okay.
Right.
And maybe that stems from, for 6 months, they weren't able to go see their friends, and that's all they had access to. But getting them back into the right mindset of we're going to learn from each other, just as if whether it's a real person or YouTube, it's the same thing.
Yeah, I was looking at the 5 practices for orchestrating discussions in mathematics and thinking about how it connects to our curriculum, but also thinking about how it connects to building thinking classrooms. And in monitoring, selecting, and sequencing, I think it makes having kids in groups and up at vertical non-permanent surfaces, I feel like it makes those 3 pieces easier for the teacher to kind of facilitate, right? Monitoring everybody because they're all up on vertical surfaces. You can sit in the center of the room and just see where everybody is all at once. Selecting, again, you don't have to walk around the room to select because you can see everything, and sequencing those in a certain way. And then when you're consolidating them, just bouncing, like you said, bouncing from one to the other. How do you see that working with, in the elementary school? I think you've been working with those 5 practices.
The 5 practices are embedded within the curriculum. So in some of the lessons, they are naturally part of the instructional routines that are taking place for that day. When we were in the classroom that day, I think it happened naturally. When we were in there, it wasn't something that was in addition to
and it wasn't called out.
No, it wasn't called out, but it just came along naturally to, I think you had them, I'm going to say you had them go to the back file cabinet based on that strategy. And then we looked at each other and we're kind of like, okay, go up here next, because of the way it went from the progression of the learning to how we wanted to sequence it. But I really felt that them being able to stand up and see really helped with them being able to make the connections to the learning goal. So in going back, they're able to see it, not just us. When we're monitoring, we monitor to see how we want to select and how we want to sequence, but they're also able to visually see that as they're working, and it's just more visible for them rather than just being under a doc cam or something like that. And they're able to make the connections and consolidate.
Right. It's no longer just a check. Oh yeah, this is our success criteria. We did it. No, this is exactly
like they've had the visual that went with it.
It's the visual.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Well, it's been great talking to you. I've got one question to wrap this up, because I already asked you about next steps, but I know that next steps as we move along, especially for elementary school, and I know we're doing this for junior high and high school, specifically about taking notes and note-taking just for your future forgetful self. And then grading. Grading is different in elementary school than it is in junior high and high school here in our district. We're moving towards a standards-based grading system. Mm-hmm. And so how do you plan on, as you're working with teachers next year, connecting some of the practices, especially what he talks about with evaluating and grading and note-taking into those classrooms with them?
I know the younger grades, having that clipboard out for math, whatever math standard or standards they're working on for the unit is really helpful because, you can collect evidence through their independent work or maybe assessment or during this group work.
So the teacher has a clipboard?
They can have a clipboard with the names down, like the left side, and then open columns of what standard they're working on. And they can just kind of like a note-taking, but, where they can just physically write in like, oh, they've got this, or this during this practice we covered this, and they demonstrated knowledge of how to do this proficiently. Because then if you're doing that as you're walking the groups or whatever, or cool downs, then when it comes time to assessment, you don't have to, you're going to give the assessment to everybody, but you're going to focus on the ones that haven't yet demonstrated, or you're going to pull those kids back for the tier 2 time.
Right. It's a real focus on the multiple points of evidence. Mm-hmm. It just doesn't have to do with the test.
No, because
you keep the clipboard and you're taking evidence as they're working.
The observational notes.
Observational notes. Yeah, and I think he has some tools for that in there too, which I think might be handy.
So I think that would help elementary.
I think also the further use of how to use the proficiency scales that we've rolled those out this year. I think all 4th through 6th grade teams have had the proficiency scales rolled out to them. Next year we have 5 more elementary schools for the K3, but a good chunk of them have also seen it. But how that can connect to the learning and moving the learning forward, and students being able to self-assess and all those fun things.
Great. So we have a lot of admin and teachers that listen to this podcast. Are there any final thoughts that you want to give to admin or teachers as they're thinking about putting these into practice, especially at the elementary level?
I think it's not scary, the building thinking classrooms. It's not super different. I think it does refine the work that we've been doing over the last 6 or 7 years. And you said something about how people question change sometimes, like how is it going to support this group of students or this group of students? And I think the reason we're doing the changes is so that we can support the learning of all our students. So the change might be there to help that group of students specifically. So keeping that in mind, and making mistakes on both ends, teachers and admin. Mistakes are going to happen. Look what Melanie did. She shut down a whole 4th grade class in 3 seconds. But, you learn from that and you know what to do and what not to do next time. And I think that we just need to acknowledge that it's not going to be perfect the first time, or maybe the second time, or the third time, or even, when we're in March. Just keep that in mind.
And I think it's good to note when you walk into a classroom that is doing this, just the level of engagement and students on task versus maybe a worksheet in front of them at their desk. Yeah. So whether it is correct work or not correct work, if they're talking and they're learning from their peers, that's what school should be.
Yeah. Great. Thank you both for having this conversation with me. I really enjoyed it, and I think our listeners are going to enjoy it too. Thank you.